if you could offer one piece of advice to an aspiring writer of any age, what would it be?
So I'm going to cheat a little because my advice is sort of 3 pieces of advice, which is read a lot, write a lot, and find passions to pursue that aren't reading and writing.
Now, well, that's fair. Those 3 go hand in hand. But what do you mean by passions to pursue that aren't reading and writing?
I think a lot of times people who aspire to be writers, particularly a lot of the young people I interact with, think that wanting to be a writer means you can't want to be or do other things as well. And I've always been kind of the exact opposite of that. I always wanted to be a writer and something else. So when I was little, it was a writer and a lawyer, a writer and a doctor. I'm a writer and a psychology professor now. I don't think it necessarily has to be another occupation. But I think the thing that gives you something to write about is pursuing other interests and other passions. And it can be, professionally, it can be extracurricularly, it can be through travel and through talking to people. But I think being a writer means being interested in people and life and living, because that's what you're mining. So I think really cultivating other things that you really care about and that you know about just gives you so much more to write about.
That's smart. So in a way, the passion can become the writing. There can be some bleed.
Right. And my passions always make their way into my writing.
Right.
Eventually.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what makes them cool. And you obviously are like the exemplar of someone with multiple interests, having 18 published books yourself, plus being known as one of the, if not the world's foremost expert on the psychology of fiction, right? Am I calling that the right thing?
Yeah, the psychology of fiction, the psychology of fandom. I would say there are several other experts who I admire very much as well and whose work informs my own. But it really was this thing. I was in grad school getting my Ph.D. in psychology, which I'd always been very interested in. I'd done a bunch of research, and I had already published books because I wrote my first published novel when I was 19. Wow. And in undergraduate, it came out right after I graduated college, book, right? Young adult. And so I was in grad school, and I had this moment where I thought the wonderful thing about psychology is that there's a psychology of literally everything. As long as it involves people, there's a psychology of it. And so I diverted my whole graduate study to be from what I was studying previously, which was actually primate cognition, to actually studying the psychology of fiction and the imagination, because that's what I was passionate about. So for a long time, I had these 2 completely separate passions. Like I was writing books in undergrad, but I was also going to an island off the coast of Puerto Rico to do primate cognition research and figuring out how monkeys viewed the world. And then I did a master's, and I did autism research with my master's, and I was doing all of this research. And then I realized that it would really be an awesome thing if I could bring my 2 passions together. So now I've really reached this place where my writing and everything I encounter as a reader and a writer and someone who talks to other writers informs the research I do in psychology. And the psychology informs how I write my books and what I write about.
That's fantastic. Now, explain, what do you mean when you're talking about the psychology of fiction? What does that mean?
So one of the big puzzles at the center of what I'd call the psychology of fiction is this question of why do we even like fiction at all? Mm-hmm. So if you're a psychologist, particularly if you're an evolutionary psychologist, this is a huge puzzle. Why would the human species have evolved to be a species that is incredibly prone to spending amazing amounts of time and money and emotion on something we know quite well as make-believe?
Right. Makes sense.
So that's the big question that motivated a lot of this field of study, was people trying to answer this question of why do we do this weird fiction thing at all? And of course, people have come up with a huge number of theories about how a preference for fiction might have evolved. Is it an adaptation that conveyed an adaptive benefit? Is it a byproduct that came along for free with something else? Why is the human brain built to do this? So that's one of the things that I study. I also study, for example, the effects of engaging with fiction. So in my lab, we'll bring people in, we'll have them read something or often watch something on television, and then we'll see if it affects, for example, how good they are at reading people after they engage in that. So we had a study that we published where we brought people in and we either had them watch Mad Men or West Wing or like a science documentary. And then afterwards we had them do an emotion reading task where they were just reading the emotions in people's faces. And after watching those award-winning television dramas, people were better at reading emotions than they were after watching the documentary.
There's a lot of research, isn't there, indicating we have this stereotype that readers are all like, closeted, introspective, hiding in the library. It's an escape, that sort of thing. But what you're saying is almost just the opposite, right? So
the best, particularly with books, the best evidence is for correlation. So there's been replicated many, many times, an effect first found by Raymond Marr and colleagues, that people who have more lifetime exposure to fiction also are better at reading people, higher self-reported empathy, more openness to experience, kind of all of these traits. Correlationally, that result is very strong because it's replicated many times. When you try and do the causal experiments, like the one I just described, sometimes it seems to work when you assign people to read something, and sometimes it doesn't. So I've published both positive results there, but also non-replications. So the field is kind of in flux right now, in part because, at least because I think it has to do with how you read. Because there are many different ways of reading. So as a field, we're really just starting to grapple with what the actual mechanism that might allow fiction to have some of these effects might be. Now, what do you mean by the different ways of reading? Are you talking about print versus audio, or I'm print versus ebooks? There's a tiny bit of evidence that might matter, but I'm talking more about like the personal experience of reading. So two variables that I've written about pretty extensively are imaginative engagement and emotional investment. So one of the things I study is the psychology of fandom. Right. And I would argue that fans show very high levels of both. So when I say imaginative engagement, I mean, how much are you as a reader contributing to the book as you read? Like how much of it is just a passive experience where you're consuming what the author gives you? And how much of it is you doing things like theorizing about what's going to happen and filling in backstories and reading between gaps and reading into deeper meaning and bringing your own hopes and experiences to the table? Right? So a reader who's very imaginatively engaged is actually co-authoring with the authors they read. And if you look in fandom, you actually see people literally co-authoring the text with fan fiction, where they will literally go and create their own version of some of these things, like make what they want to happen, or write a really fleshed out backstory for a character who didn't have one in the text. So it's kind of the extreme version of imaginative engagement. So as a writer, I definitely want readers really imaginatively engaged as they read. So I will try and, so I think very strategically about what kinds of things can you do, what kinds of gaps can you leave to leave the reader something to do. So are you saying it's what you put in or what you leave out that creates this reader engagement? I think it's both. So I think some things you leave out for them to then contribute and imagine. So there are moments, sometimes it's as simple as where you're cutting a chapter. Do you go till after absolutely everything has happened? Or do you cut off a little before that? Where you end the chapter. Where you end the chapter, right? And like what's happening in between chapters. You don't want it to be that nothing's happening in between chapters, because then the readers don't have anything to imagine, right? You want some of the good stuff to actually be happening off page. Right. But of course, you have to have enough good stuff happening on the page to get readers emotional investment there, right? So it's this thing of you want them imaginatively engaged, but you also want them to really care about the characters. So it's this balancing act between doing those two things. Because in my opinion, fandom happens when you have the extremely high levels of both the emotion and the imagination engaged in a text. So I'm sure all the writers listening to this are thinking, well, that's what I want. I want everybody to care about my characters and being engaged. Any suggestions, any tips on how to make that happen? On how to do that? Well, one huge thing I think is backstories.
But you don't want to dump that
No,
all in
you don't
chapter
want to
one.
dump all of it in chapter one. One of the things that you have to do is you have to make readers work for things. One of the delightful things about fiction is that we have access to other people's minds that we would never get in reality. So in reality, you're never actually inside someone else's head. You might think you know what they're thinking or feeling, but you can never have 100% certainty. Even if they tell you what they're thinking or feeling, they might be lying, right? You never can be someone else. But in fiction, you can be. You have this intimate access to other people's emotions. Like even on, if you think about television shows, there are always those scenes where the person turns away from the group and then their face crumbles. Mm-hmm. And no one in their world sees that moment of vulnerability. Right. But you do. There's a scholar, an English scholar named Lisa Sunshine, who's written about this. She called that those moments of embodied transparency, where you're suddenly very physical and transparent in the middle of something in a way that the audience can tell what you're feeling, but the people in your world don't necessarily get to see. Right. And when you talk about books and fiction, right, you get to actually get inside people's heads a lot. So it's this balancing act because what they call theory of mind, which is our ability to get inside other people's minds, is what scholars like Raymond Marr and Keith Oatley think drives us towards books to begin with. It's that interest in other people's minds. So you can't just lay out what everyone's thinking or feeling right on the surface, because then we're not getting any practice, right? We like a certain level of...
Show, don't tell, people would say.
We like a certain level of challenge, right? But at the same time, fiction doesn't serve as good practice at all if it's too hard, if you don't ever find out what's real. So a lot of what books do is they throw down theory of mind challenges. Like think of a mystery. Who did this? Who has the motivation to do this? Why did they do this? And then they guide you through the process through which you eventually figure that out. Or in a mystery, maybe you don't figure it out, but then the motivation is explained later and you can kind of track back through everything that happened. So I think people do get invested in characters that they have to work to read a little. One of the things we found in my lab that's really interesting is we were studying what's called a parasocial relationship. That's a one-sided relationship you form with someone you don't know, like a fictional character or a celebrity, just because you've consumed media about that person. So like you might really feel like you know Taylor Swift or your favorite fictional character because you've read so much about them, but you don't really know them. They don't know you, right? So one thing we were interested in is we have this study that's currently in progress, but it has some really interesting preliminary results because we were interested in what are the traits of characters that make people more likely to form parasocial relationships with them. So we have people think of a favorite character and then they do this scale about them. But we're like, what characters are people picking? And one of the things that we've found a couple times now, it's super preliminary but super interesting to me, is we found that there's a specific aspect of psychology that seems to be more common in favorite characters than in real people, called an avoidant attachment style.
Interesting.
Attachment style has to do with how you view yourself and other people and what you're like in relationships. It seems to be set, at least in part, by your relationship with your parents in infancy and early childhood. So like, do you view the world as a safe place and have a positive view in yourself and your other? You'd have what we call secure attachment style. If you're never really sure if your needs are going to be met and you're kind of clingy and you're terrified of people leaving, that would be what we call an anxious attachment style. And an avoidant attachment style, which is what we saw at a higher rate in fictional characters than real people, those are people who have a positive view of themselves but a negative view of other people. So like, why bother with relationships or love or people at all?
People who are above it all, sort of?
Kind of people who are standoffish and push other people away. We found this fascinating because this isn't that common. You know, secure is the predominant attachment style among real people.
Well, but you don't want to be married.
right. But avoidant characters were much more common than avoidant people were among this favorite character list. And I started thinking about that. And we haven't explored why yet. But I looked at some of the characters people had written down. And it would be someone like, for instance, Sherlock from the BBC's Sherlock. Right. Ahead. And so I started thinking about it and thinking about it in terms of these parasocial relationships. And my working theory is that I think we want for characters to have at least one close relationship with someone else because we want to know that they're capable of being close to people. But I think readers may like characters who don't have a ton of close relationships because then they feel more important. So in the Sherlock one, you have a close parasocial relationship with Sherlock. It fools you into thinking you're a friend and you know him so well, and like it feels two-sided even though it's one-sided. So I think the reason people like avoidant characters is because on some level they're saying, well, John is Sherlock's number one, but I'm number two.
Sweet. I've heard